I think this overlooked is the title track itself. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful melody. I think it's really beautifully sung. I think it's one of his best songs, certainly one of his most underrated songs.
Heart of Saturday Night was supposed to be almost a, I don't want to say a concept album, but to a certain extent it is. It's almost like a continuing arc. It starts off when you're getting ready for the Saturday night and everything, and it's full of possibilities and everything, and you go through everything, and it doesn't work out quite the way you seem, and you end up in some diner at like 4 in the morning eating eggs and everything, and staring at all the traveling salesmen who are miserable with their lives. So yeah, they were trying to do almost a concept. It's not exactly a concept, but there was definitely a narrative arc to it.
The narrative lyricism that Waits had previously developed on Closing Time was again present, and he was becoming one of modern music's most notable chroniclers of the lives of the American loser, the loves lost and the dreams forgotten.
Insofar as outsiders and bohemians are important in American culture, and I certainly agree that they are, it's not such a bad thing to be reminded that there is this world of seedy bars. Not so seedy. I mean, you know, it's not like, this is not a Skid Row kind of guy. The Heart of Saturday Night is not about the Bowery, it's not about Skid Row, it's about, say a bar and a motel on the outskirts of a medium-sized city, where there's salesmen drinking, and there's drunks drinking, and there's a few floozies drinking, maybe, maybe not, and there's some ordinary people who go there for a drink. And that world of sad, lonely, but not necessarily desperate or impoverished alienation is a world that it's always been one of the implicit subjects and locales of what he writes about.
There was a premise to Tom Waits' early records, and the premise was that you were interested in the lives of these characters. You know, if you were the kind of person who was going to walk into the seedy bar and say, oh, there's a drunken bum over there, and walk out, well, you know, you weren't going to be sitting there listening to Tom Waits. But if you were the kind of person whose imagination started, well, what was that guy's life like? You know, how did he end up here? You know, what happened here? You know, if there was an element of, you know, who washed up on the shore of the Promised Land? You know, that kind of, you know, L.A. being, you know, the ultimate destination and the final burying place of Western culture in a way. You know, Tom Waits was interested in finding out where the body's buried, and that's where those guys were. But you know, you had to be interested in that. You know, if you know, if those stories had no appeal to you, there was no way, there was no route in.
Let's put a new coat of paint on and love them more down. Set them up, and knocking them down. You wear a dress, baby, now wear a tie.
The record came out really, really good, I think. I was really pleased with it. And it was a wonderful, wonderful collaboration. We had a great time making it. And, you know, Tom said, God, it was so much fun, it was over so quickly. I said, well, you know, that's what happens. You get prepared, and then you go in and you make the record.
Both Howe and Waits shared a mutual love of Jack Kerouac, and Bones would aid the development of Waits' beat persona. The music of the Beats, as well as their writing style, was to be a major influence on the Heart of Saturday Night.
I did a lot of records with Norman Granz as an engineer, and he used to give me a lot of responsibility in supervising sessions, and one of the things he did was he gave me a bunch of tapes that had been recorded in a Miami hotel room with Jack Kerouac and said, take these tapes and make an album out of it. So I did. It was an album called The Beat Generation, surprise, surprise, and I cut it all together and made the album. And I told Tom about that. He said, oh, if I could have a copy. He said, do you know that Jack Kerouac and Steve Allen made a record together with Steve Allen playing? I said, I don't know. He said, oh, I got a tape of it. I'll give it. So it began with that sort of, the two of us going back and forth and talking about music we liked and so on.
One key album for Waits was Blues and Haikus, in which Kerouac's spoken word poetry and jazz fused spectacularly.
In my medicine cabinet, the winter fly has died of old age.
The thing about Beat was a bit of everything. I mean, it was that defiance of authority, it was the love of jazz, it was that sense of freedom that America could give you. And Waits really picked up on that. So I think you cannot underestimate the influence of Kerouac particularly, and On the Road, and the whole Beat thing on Tom Waits. And I think it began to manifest itself on Heart of Saturday Night, but then I think gradually he picked up on it. He really sort of put on the Kerouac jacket, and it stayed with him for a long time.
Well, these diamonds on my windshield and these tears from heaven. Well, I'm pulling into town on the interstate. I got a steel train in the rain.
I think he was really making a statement with Diamonds on a Windshield. That was something that, you know, that was a new flavour that had not been heard on the first record. It was probably, you know, influenced by people like Lord Buckley, you know. You've got to kind of detect the influence of, you know, of scat singers, of jazz comedians, even of, you know, your Lenny Bruces and your Mort Salls. You know, this is a very California nightclub, beatnik kind of humour. So that started to come out on the second album.
On its release, The Heart of Saturday Night failed to reach the size of audience that Waits had been expecting. While he went on the road adding to a slowly building fan base, manager Herb Cohen thought of new ways in which the singer could reach a bigger audience.
Herb Cohen came up with the idea of Tom doing a live album. He said, you know, he goes over so great in a club, we should do a live album with him. And we tried to think of a club we could go in to make the second album. And we couldn't find one where we thought we could actually control the sound and have any kind of control over the crowd. I said to Herb, you know, there's a room in the back of the Record Plant recording studio in Hollywood. And they actually recorded a live album back there with Barbra Streisand with a big symphony orchestra. What we could do is turn that around and make the room, the big studio, a club, and put a stage in there and just record Tom live with an audience in this room, and we can invite an audience.
Whereas jazz records had often involved fresh, unreleased material recorded in front of a live audience, this was a rare move in popular music. Titled Nighthawks at the Diner, the finished work required little tampering after it had been recorded.
There are two nights, and some of the takes on the album are from the first night and some are from the second night, but we didn't mess around with them. We didn't cut them together or redo the voice or do any of that. It's all live just like it happened. And this album, it came out so good that they decided that it was too long for one LP. So they said, well, we'll make it a double LP. We'll release it as a double LP. They were so excited about it.
Warm beer, cold women, oh, I just don't fit in.
People felt the formula was beginning to wear a little thin. I personally don't think that. I think it was actually getting more and more honed by the time we reach this record. But I think it's more about authenticity, and people began to wonder whether this bohemian barstool philosopher was a real character or whether it was just a theatrical construct. And I think people perhaps became a little bit suspicious that it was the latter.
Well, I mean, I think until you got to know Waits and you started to really believe in the character, you started to sort of see the depth of what he was doing, it kind of looked like a bit of a pastiche, in a sense, you know. I think initially there was some suspicion, you know, that it seemed a bit phony, whereas Springsteen singing about New Jersey and, you know, Asbury Park and all of that was seen as kind of contemporary. It's very easy to parody your kind of hip daddy-o beatnik character.
The album had also split opinion with its inclusion of the kind of lengthy monologues that Waits used to introduce the tracks live. This comic, theatrical element of his stage persona showed the strong influence of stand-up comedians on Waits, particularly Lenny Bruce and Lord Buckley.
This is a bit I did in 1961 at the Jazz Workshop. There were 200 people there, and 2 were offended. 2 peace officers, and they did the act with Judge Axelrod, and to as a preposition, come as a verb, to come. The infinitive form of the verb, the verb intransitive.
He definitely was very interested in a lot of comedians like Lenny Bruce and Mort Saul and Harry the Hipster and people like that. He was all adding that into his career and into his persona, and to a certain extent he's distanced himself from that. In Nighthawks to the Diner, I think to a certain extent the stories at the beginning and the end almost overshadowed the music in there. And maybe it's just because it's not one of my favorite albums anyway. There were some great songs on there, Warm Beer, Cold Women, and Eggs and Sausage, but I think just having all these really long sort of almost comedy skits in between, it somewhat overshadowed the music in the album.
I toast to Yogi Berra, Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, Casey Stengel, and the Brooklyn Dodgers. Over the river and down the hill, right around the corner, just you and me under the tree, over to the Blarney Stone, up your ass with a wah-wah brush and break it off.
I think the elements of wit on the record also gave some people a problem because they didn't see it as wit, they saw it as comedy. And comedy then becomes a novelty act. And Randy Newman has struggled at times in his career with the same thing. I mean, Randy Newman is just the most brilliantly funny songwriter, but because he has this wonderful wit, he's sometimes regarded as less than 100% serious, somehow a little bit lightweight. So I think the wit on this record, and I would call it wit rather than comedy, perhaps some people didn't get. I mean, a song like Better Off Without a Wife almost becomes Tom Waits' version of the mother-in-law joke, if you like. But I think actually the wit gives him a whole new layer.
The Waits voice was also developing, the early melodiousness being slowly replaced by a distinct growl.
I said, since you left me, baby. Since you left me, baby. Since you left me, baby, we've been talking about late night and early morning low clouds, with a chance of fog and a chance of showers into the afternoon.
I think the voice was also initially regarded as somehow inauthentic.
I love jazz.
He seemed to be influenced by people like Louis Armstrong and possibly Hoagy Carmichael.
Yes, they got a beat that's all the reason. I'm telling you, they got air.
Tom Waits' voice, in that early period of his career, it does develop. It does get noticeably more growly. It gets deeper. It does at times get hammed up to the point of being self-parodic. I mean, I think yes, he was reaching for that Louis Armstrong sound, and a lot of the time does end up sounding slightly more like Oscar the Grouch from Sesame Street. That's not always a bad thing.
Well, it's been kind of 1034 millibar high pressure zone, extending from my eyes down to my cheeks. I'll get by. Even though since you left me, baby, it's getting cold out there.
The argument or otherwise about the authenticity of Tom Waits's voice, and for that matter about his music or about his lyrics, is a fairly specious one. I mean, in fact all artists of any sort are self-created to some extent or another, and he was no more or less than that. Certainly he did, it's certainly arguable that he did begin to descend into cliche at various points during his career, but you would get, there'd be another Tom Waits album and, gosh, here's a surprise, it's another song of, another album full of aggressively growled songs about barflies and junkies.
I think in later albums he attempted to pull himself away from that, but I think at the same time he's also fairly relaxed about the fact that this is what he does. And he does do it extremely well. He's a very fine lyricist and a very inventive musician, and certainly a very distinctive singer, and there are really very few people you can say that about.